Welcome to all who are joining us today. The Center for Law, Arts and the Humanities at the ANU College of Law, Law and Humanities, part of CERSA at Université Panthéon-Assas, the Centre Bentham at Sciences Po Paris Law School, Vallée and Prisme at Université Sorbonne Nouvelle, are proud to announce the Surveillance and Humanities virtual conference series. The event is funded by an AFRAN grant. At the start of today's conference, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past and present. The series of conferences spring from the finding that surveillance has become even more critical to public policy and corporations. In a world dramatically changed by the COVID-19 pandemic, scholars from law, literature, genetics, cybersecurity, art, anthropology, philosophy, sociology will gather together over a series of events for 3 weeks to address the new meaning, scope, and representation of surveillance. We are happy to welcome our panelists and attendees to participate in a conversation between arts, humanities, and the various fields in which surveillance is used. I am Anne Brunon-Ernst, and I will be your chair today, as well as being one of the organizers of the conference series, with Jelena Gliglorievich, who is lecturer at the ANU School of Law and specializes in media law and constitutional law and theory, with Claire Brobel, who is assistant professor in English at Panthéon-Assas University and has published articles on Gothic authors and reworking of Gothic tropes in contemporary works, as well as contemporary literary variations on panopticism and surveillance. And with Desmond Manderson, who is professor at the ANU School of Law and an international leader in interdisciplinary scholarship in law and the humanities. We are honored to welcome Professor Lesley Siebeck for this first conference in our series. Professor Lesley Siebeck was appointed as Foundation CEO of the ANU Cyber Institute in 2018. Most recently, she was Chief Investment and Advisory Officer at the Digital Transformation Agency, arriving there from the Bureau of Meteorology, where she served as Chief Information Officer. She was recognized as Federal Government CIO of the Year in 2017, and in 2019, she was appointed to the Naval Shipbuilding Advisory Board. Professor Siebeck has extensive experience in strategy, policy, management, budget, information technology, and research roles in the Australian Public Service, industry, and academia. She has worked in the departments of finance, defense, and the Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Office of National Assessment, and as an IT and management consultant in private industry, and at 2 universities. Professor Siebeck has a PhD in information technology, an MBA, a master's in defense studies, and a bachelor's degree in applied science physics. Professor Siebeck's presentation starts with the assessment that in our digital society, we have grown used to being tracked. Our movements, preferences, and social networks quantified, linked, logged, and transmitted. The advent of COVID-19 is disrupting normality and accelerating many trends, including the widespread use of digital tools. With that has come increasing levels of surveillance and control, unanticipated only months ago, in the name of public health. What can we say about the use of technology for this purpose? What is normal going to look like post-pandemic? And what effects will such technology and tolerance of surveillance have on our society? These are some of the questions that Professor Siebeck wishes to address today in her 40-minute talk. Attendees are welcome to ask questions via the Q&A button or by raising their hands. 20 to 25 minutes at the end of Professor Siebeck's talk will be allocated for a discussion. A few things about how today's forum will run. Your microphone has automatically been muted. The chat function has been disabled. To submit a question, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. To ask a question, just raise the hand in the chat function. We will unmute you. But remember to also unmute from your end before asking the question. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, please contact us. This event is being recorded. Your display name and any question you ask may be included in the recording. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Siebeck for her talk on In Sickness and in Health, Surveillance in the Age of COVID.
Great, thank you very much, Anne, and I appreciate that introduction. Thank you, and thank you all for everyone who's come in to listen to the talk. I'm going to be screen sharing, so this might take a bit of making sure this works. Share. Okay. Okay, so as mentioned, I'm interested in the questions around what sort of types of surveillance we're looking at as a result of the pandemic and how this plays into the broader questions of surveillance that are now applying in our society. Just to start with, I will just note that I started my career as a policy officer, and that tends to be the lens through which I look at these sort of questions. I'm concerned with the shape and future of society, economy and security, and I'll always argue for the development of strategy to deal with issues, and particularly the use of systems thinking. The second point I'll just note in starting is that this is an atypical time. It's highly disruptive. It's fast-moving, disjointed, we have unclear data, contested models of the world. And there are many people smarter than I am looking and thinking about this at the moment. And so what I'll be doing is making a series of observations about the trends and behaviours. And to be frank, I'm not certain where they're all going to lead. So if I've missed anything, please forgive me, and I appreciate feedback, and I really look forward to the Q&A because this is a highly contested issue at the moment. So that frames the presentation. So what I'll be doing is quickly going through some judgments, to start with. I'll be making a series of observations throughout the talk. I'll be looking at COVID and the technology that's being applied, or the ones that is of concern to us in that area of surveillance. I'll be looking at applications and consequences. These are the things that are arising out. They're almost second order things, but they're arising out of some of the technologies or responses to COVID. And then security trends. And I think that's important because that's framing a lot of how governments, in particular in the West, are seeing some of these issues, and then how we might respond to these. So some initial judgments from the last 6 to 9 months. First, it's clear that COVID-19 is an accelerant. It itself is not a disruptor. It's accelerating a whole range of trends, which together are starting to cause fractures in society and challenging our conceptual models of the world and how we are actually working through those. It's actually stress testing nations. So out of this, we've learned that it's not a particular form of government that's doing particularly well and better than others. We can point to authoritarian illiberal regimes that aren't doing very well. We can point to China, where the CCP has managed to, as far as we can tell, control and contain the virus. We can also point to democracies that are doing quite well. Variously, some in Europe, of course, New Zealand, Taiwan has managed to control the virus. South Korea is doing a reasonably good job as well. And on the other hand, we're sort of seeing what's happened in the United States, where it's, we'd have to say that it is out of control. So we can't sort of draw conclusions around types of governance. One key accelerated trend, of course, is the use of technology. And that's being driven by, and again, this is where the acceleration comes into play. We've seen these trends for a while: working from home, more digitalization, greater use of data, increasing dependency on those big tech platforms. But solutionism, the leaping, what Evgeny Morozov calls solutionism, leaping to try and solve every problem with a technology solution, is driving that further as well, and is of concern to us. A further trend is that it does take a state, to quote Frank Fukuyama. What we've learned is actually we do need governments, and governments and the role of governments have been discounted for quite some time in the West. But it's platforms that are doing best. Platforms are receiving the money to fund what governments can no longer do. Last week, also seeing health security, or the emergence of medico-techno security, and that's the new norm. And this is also some of the core points of this talk. It's in contrast, or is building on, more likely, probably a better way of putting it, it's building on some of those post-Cold War understandings of security, and also using the tools of surveillance capitalism. And that's giving that a boost. And so we're sort of seeing that drive through as well. If I were to look at trying to understand where these points of pressure are coming, typically when we talk about health and medicine, we go directly to the patient. And a lot of the discussion around medical technologies in the past have tended to be about how we can support the patient. But by and large, what's happening is that those aren't changing radically. We are getting better ventilators, PPE is an issue. So you're seeing things at the hospital level. The management of patients, how you actually look after them in intensive care, etc., is important. The broader health system too is being able to use technologies to better effect. But by and large, that's not affecting society because it's an acceleration of trend in a particular area. What's actually happening though is when you start looking at how these health technologies or techno-medical technologies are being applied at the level of society and how governance is being, or not being in some cases, applied. And beyond that, we're seeing what's happening at the global system because this is a true pandemic. Typically, often in the past, even with the Spanish flu, which affected a number of countries and was global, it does not have quite the reach that we can see now with COVID-19. And that's a result of globalization, of the greater transportation links, of the movement of people across the globe. So let's have a quick look at the 5 areas of technology that have emerged in the last 6 to 9 months. The first is a fairly traditional one, epidemiological pattern modeling. So this is tracking the progress of disease, actually understanding the genetics and the different clades of the underlying genetics of the disease and working out what's contributing to what, and therefore you're getting greater insights into the diagnosis of some of the, symptoms and the disease itself. And that's what you'd traditionally expect. This is classic intelligence. This sort of thing has been around for quite some time. It's a useful tool for governments to understand the progress of the disease over time and what they can expect. So that's a good outcome. That also draws up, incidentally, it's very much a bottom-up process. So the data is taken at the patient or clinical level and then fed into a larger system. So it's a classic collection of that sort of data and processing of that information. The second is more contentious, and that's contact tracing and tracking. And this is where, again, a good example of solutionism. The idea that you can have an app for that, and the app will give you the insights into the spread of the disease in the population. The difficulty is, of course, is that it's much more intrusive than what we would expect at the at the traditional epidemiological modelling of disease and disease patterns. The data can be there, collected to provide social graphs of contacts, such as you see there on the right. And this is information that is quite valuable to a range of players, potentially for the purpose of health, but also to a range of other interested parties. It could be everything from sort of boyfriends who are upset about who someone might be seeing. It could be, tax authorities wanting to know the sort of who people are talking to for the purpose of business, for example. It could be, again, nation states understanding what the social networks are of key individuals that he has contacted, etc. And besides which, on top of that too, there is no automatic assumption that people should be surveilled in such a fashion. So this impinges on everything from freedom of association to freedom of movement, freedom of speech, etc., particularly when you're talking about whistleblowers, etc., and again, freedom of the press. So for these reasons, as well as issues around the security of the app, it's been, the apps in a range of countries have been pushed back and with low levels of take-up. In a couple of cases, I understand they've been abandoned. But the other thing about the apps, it's not just what's on your phone. It is also that broader ecosystem around it. The data on the phone will be stored in a database. That database is then sort of passed on to others. So that sense that you don't actually have a control about who gets data or the security or privacy provisions is also of concern to a wide range of people in the public. Beyond that, then we have the issues around movement. So this is the first of some movement technologies. So quarantine and travel permission. At the moment, these are photos here of the Hong Kong electronic bracelet. The first iteration was a cardboard bracelet and an app that you were required to download on your phone. You then check in that where you are with that app, noting the Q code on your bracelet. That has also been supplemented by the larger bracelet there, which actually does track movements. So the idea here is that people who are coming into a country, of course, they may actually be carrying the disease, but not showing symptoms yet, so they need to be tracked and people are in quarantine. We all know what the rules are these days. This is becoming more widespread as people are actually skipping quarantine or moving outside quarantine. And so governments have chosen to be far more coercive in how they deal with this. There may be some very good reasons as to why people are finding that they need to exit quarantine. The difficulty is, of course, they've been infecting others and we've seen spread as a result. But rather than sort of digging into that and perhaps finding other mitigating measures, it is the movement technology that is providing the solutions here. The WA government said a couple of days ago it would be looking for the same. And of course, in Western nations, these carry a particular message around it. This is the sort of things that are applied to criminals. And now the implication is that people are being treated as though they've already done something wrong, as opposed to, we just need you to quarantine because we need to make sure that you're not spreading the disease. Travel permissions too have been closed down. Now the thing here is that we all forget, or we tend to forget until we actually go through, is that we are facing, every time we pass through those barriers in Australia at Sydney Airport, Melbourne, etc., that relies on facial recognition. And so a lot of the technologies are already in place to ensure that we cannot go overseas, we cannot travel beyond our borders. Of course, it's in some regards, it's easier to manage when you are in Australia where most people fly in and out of the country. But I do start to wonder at what point we're going to see this actually applied within the country at state borders. To some extent, we're already doing that already with the recognition of number plates and being able to sort of, people being directly asked, but that number plate recognition is being used as a tool. We don't actually have much insight or, as to the extent of this. We only see bits of reporting every now and then. I do know that in Melbourne, for example, that number plates were being tracked even between suburbs to see whether people were staying inside those suburbs that were initially quarantined. Then we get down to a bit more personal level, which is social distancing and movement bans. And we've seen a range of different technologies in play here. The one on the left is Spot, which was used in a park in Singapore to warn people to keep socially distancing. It was rather awkward and a bit scary. This little sort of robotic dog making a fair bit of noise going around, telling people to, reminding them about social distancing. However, now we're seeing again more coercive effects of uses of technology. Drones have been used in France and I believe in Italy to check social distancing on beaches. The Victorian police are talking about using drones to check that people are wearing masks in public spaces. So your freedom of movement is being curtailed. Freedom of association, again, similarly. And again, whether you're wearing a mask or not and abiding by those health protocols is being checked. And again, these are coercive measures. I did actually ask initially when they wanted to apply fines to anyone outside with a mask, why the police just weren't handing out masks as a way of encouraging people to wear masks and make it socially acceptable. But instead, they've gone down that coercive route of fines and potentially, again, moving people into quarantine spaces. The second picture there is, again, the acceleration of the use of technology in the workplace to check on employees. This is in an Amazon's warehouse where camera technology is being used to assess whether people are keeping the appropriate social distancing as they're walking along corridors. That builds on technology, which for a long time, when you work, for example, in the national security community, you're used to being checked. You go in the doors, your biometrics are checked. Even 30 odd years ago, there was a little sensor in your room saying whether your room was occupied or not. But this is now becoming more widespread. You can understand it when potentially where you're dealing with sensitive materials, etc. But as I said, it's just becoming commonplace, and for no better reason really than to, in this case, again, we're finding that pressure to abide by these health rules rather than elements of trust. There is a lack of trust here because of the imposition of technology is becoming more commonplace, and we'll see another example of that in a moment. And last, there's symptom tracking. Now, a lot of this is actually done with the contact trace and track technology, or that's what is said occurs. But this is actually one of the few upsides I've seen in this application of technology in the pandemic. On the left there, we have a COVID symptom tracker. That's a result of a partnership between the National Health Service in the UK and King's College London. And what is happening here is it's giving people agency to put in their, if they've got symptoms. It's not saying it's going to track them. It's not saying it's going to trace them. And as a result, it's actually got a fair uptake. And it's taking advantage of the same thing that drives people to wear Fitbits and so on. People actually want to know how they are, and they want to have that tracked. The other thing about this too is that there are actual outcomes of that. The data that's being collected is actually being published now. So people can see outcomes of this as a result. It's not being hidden behind closed doors. It's evident that there are good things coming out of it. There's insights which are emerging, which is actually helping public health more generally. And even Fitbit itself is using the data it's collecting to see whether there's something that will come out of it. Now, this is, again, an element of solution is in that you do see in the tech industry. We have data, good things will result. As opposed to really, what is the question we should be asking, and is the data right for that? But at least there is elements of that. And the great thing about these technologies is it's personal, in the sense that people are making the decision. They're being given agency. It's with trusted institutions in the case of the NHS and King's College. And the people can see outcomes. They are getting there is a feedback loop there which is reinforcing it. That is not evident for any of the others that I've mentioned so far. What a lot of these things are doing too is that, again, it's pushing acceleration of those trends in other areas. So this is the sort of second order or higher level of effects. The first, of course, is working from home. And I've used that picture because I was trying to find a picture of a parent child where I couldn't really see the child's face. But yes, it's now we're working from home. Their kids are at home. We're using things like Zoom, Dropbox, the Outlook and the Google Suites a lot more. There's things such as using collaborative tools such as Slack and a whole range of other tools which are there. And we've just quickly, rapidly, almost breathtaking, moved on to those platforms. So there is one clear winner in terms of the economy and use, and that is those tech platforms. It brings with it a whole range of other issues, but one of the other things we're seeing too is, again, this push into the home of monitoring. So this is from a company that does sell monitoring software. This is an example of the dashboards. There's about 3 or 4 other tabs that you can look at as well. It is oriented around the question that is being answered, that they're proposing this technology for is your employee being productive? We can track this. Others are there to say, is your employee engaged? Are they online? And both of these are in the intrusion of the workplace into private spaces. So people are, putting up photos of their house online. You can sort of tell so much about, people and so on. They're projecting what they want to be, seen as well. Schools are now seeing the house as part of that area. So you're seeing a blurring of those spaces between work and school and play. And it's not just location, you're seeing it in terms of time as well. People are working sort of 12 to 14 hours days because their office is their home. And that's for those people who can. But what you're seeing is, again, this push into the workplace, the blurring of spaces and the erosion of the private and the personal. There is considerable downside to, aside from the downsides of the monitoring, which are not substantial in that intrusion, the other downsides, of course, have to do with security. So the other thing that's happened during the pandemic is an uptick in security incidents. Everything from phishing, playing on people's desire to have information and therefore clicking on sites that look remarkably like official sites, to actual attacks. And you can tell it's cyber because there's blue light, there's a guy with a hoodie, and there's an industrial type landscape. So it must be cyber. But we are seeing, an increase in attacks and an increasingly dangerous threat landscape for everyone from governments to organisations to small business to institutions like universities to, of course, users. Because now the workplace is in the home. Your home was not set up to be so secure. It doesn't have the firewalls your workplace would be. It doesn't have this, the cybersecurity operations centre that many workplaces would have. And so it may well end up that your child's homework is a threat vector into your organisation. So that's one thing, and that's very worrying, and it is changing the landscape and the environment as well. It is making it more dangerous. The other one is the rise of conspiracy theories. Now, I have to admit, this is a photo from the protest in Melbourne earlier this year, and it was an education. I hadn't heard of most of those conspiracy theories on the poster that is being held up there. But what you will find, this is often people will say, social media is to blame. Conspiracy theories happen every time there's a pandemic. They emerge and they will, because people are reacting from fear, rumours spread, because, they often people just don't know quite what's going on. And various communities are singled out and attacked. That's the source of, again, a lot of things like, you saw pogroms in Eastern Europe. There'll be attacks against small communities dating back to Rome, etc. So the conspiracies is not a surprise. What's different now is that interconnectedness. But the issue here is that, the digital technologies are always going to have upsides, the good sides and the downsides. And one of the things we see on the good side of digital technologies is that connectivity. It's one way that we've been able to remain connected with our workplaces and our friends and families during this time of quarantine and isolation. They do include or offer the opportunity to include a wider range of voices. We do work on that, true, but it is there. It provides access to information, access to online shopping, access to food, a whole range of things through various supply chains in the physical world. So it gives you access to, as I said, opportunities, business, money, finance, a whole range of things. And it can offer insight in as much as take advantage of this. You can actually use the tools, the digital tools yourself to play with the data and get insight yourself. Just like any technology, it can be subverted and can offer the opportunity to subvert outcomes. It's a forum for espionage as well. And that can be just, the boyfriend, gaslighting the girlfriend, as easy as it can be the nation state. It offers the opportunity for sabotage, everything from industrial controllers to particular databases, to attempts to bring down or attack areas, so that you don't agree with politically, for example. And often overlooked, particularly when we talk about in this context, is the opportunity for coercion. And it means everything from limiting information or changing and directing information to denying access to things, to limiting opportunities, to denying, refusing inclusion, etc. So it can be used for the purpose of coercion, and it can be the source of coercion as well. So bearing all that in mind, again, a couple of observations. One of the things that you do learn when you review all the material here is that everyone's involved. Not only everyone's involved, but everyone is also trying, or there's a whole range of people, it's not merely government anymore, trying to offer solutions. Researchers are trying to build solutions. And often because researchers at universities will tend to work in silos, they will tend to sort of say, here's a technology solution, and trying to build those sort of things. But they at least have the opportunity to broaden themselves across the institution, across disciplines. Governments will lead to solutions as well. And similarly, there is no end of solutions that comes from the commercial sector because there's opportunities there. And that's a good thing. We need the right incentives in place. But we also need to solve the problems. And that's a longer term thing. That takes time and effort and coordination and thought and strategy. Data and distribution are even bigger issues with the platforms growing. As I've mentioned before, as I quoted Fukuyama, you need a state, but the state is no longer sufficient in and of itself. And the state is also paying a lot of money to the platforms, or the platforms are actually absorbing a lot of funding. And so they may well the state may well end up running out of money well before platforms do. Last, in democracies, it seems to be that you need that combination of trusted institution plus government. It's no longer enough for government by itself. It's got to have a trusted institution or outsider as well. Plus the openness and transparency. So you can see what's going on. You can see what use is made of data and so on. Things are put up on GitHub. The original source code is available for people to look at, etc. Plus agency, citizen control. So people want to be able to see, yes, I get to control what gets put into something. It may take a bit of time, but I can do that myself, as opposed to it's taken from me without my saying so, as I walk through a gate or something similar. And then they need to see outcomes. So they need to know that what they're doing is actually having a positive outcome. People want to have a future out of this. Without that, it will breed suspicion and pushback. We saw that again with everything from COVID. You see it in other countries with the same sort of track and trace apps, for example. We've seen breakouts of quarantines, people trying to get around the constraints around borders. There is reasons for that. And part of those will be things like conspiracies, but also part of it is a lack of trust. And again, there is a lack of a sense of the future. So let's just move on to security. And I raise this because this is the paradigm that dominates a lot of what is being done in that area of state-based surveillance. A bit of background. Much of what we had thought about intelligence agencies, defense and security are still based on Cold War ideas. And that's been, again, tends to be propagated by the media as well. Those in turn are based on World War II. This is where the spies will get out there. They do the careful assessment, collect. You have the intelligence cycle of collection, assessment, analysis, and leads to assessment, which is prepared for policymakers. And it's all done, at a arm's length distance. That's the Sherman Kent view of the world. Sherman Kent was a CIA officer in World War II and into the early 50s, and I think even the 60s, who built that, this is the objective assessment model, and really professionalized that view of assessment and made sure it was actually, helped dictate or help shape the collection. So you had a lot of controls and constraints on what was being done. The national security community was in those days better understood as being focused on one main threat, the Soviet Union, communism. Not only was that armed, it had nuclear weapons. And so it really did tend to focus attention. It was dominated by the defense and foreign affairs agencies. Secrets and insights were sought and offered by intelligence agencies, again, often at arm's length. And your internal security agencies tend to be focused on things like the protection of secrets, on counterintelligence, because there was a competition between agencies on both sides of the wall, and any sort of ideas about subversion in country. In 2010, David Oman published Securing the State, and it reflects and qualifies or reflects, and he actually put some sense around the changes in Western intelligence and the national security since the Cold War and since September 11. His thinking of the things he reflects is quite influential here in Australia. That line about the state of trust and that particular quote, you can find that in the latest independent review of the intelligence community, for example. And it's that notion of trust, it's notion about being protected and the adequate management as well as normality of life. That's really important. And he argues that this comprises three things. It comprises the protection of the individual and of daily life of the community from major disruptive events. And those are not simply military attacks. They are of course, terrorism, cyber attacks more recently, and things such as pandemics. Climate change goes into there as well. The second thing is then emphasis on the value of anticipation. Now, this is not prediction, but this is anticipating that something might go wrong. And this is really where you're starting to see that tracking and, that tracking, the surveillance, the collection of data facilitated by big data, by huge computational capabilities, etc., in nation states, and particularly in the Five Eyes. And the third arm, or the third leg of this, is building national resilience, because this is essentially a risk-based model. It's quite different to what had gone before. And Oman realizes that you're not going to be able to catch every risk. And so you need to build resilience around that. And that's around governance structures and so on as well. Now, the problem that we have is that over the last 30 years, and that would be great if you sort of said, yep, right, self-right, let's start building up from the start. The problem is that over the last 30 years, you've seen a whole range of changes inside our governance structures, particularly in democracies. You've seen the rise of the efficiency paradigm. In Australia, there's an efficiency dividend that gets taken off every year. So that makes it hard to do things like redundancy, which is good for resilience, because why should you have two when one's efficient, for example? You've seen a lot of outsourcing. There's a lot of material about how much has been outsourced from government, and particularly capability. There's been an argument a long time in government that government cannot afford to maintain a lot of the things it has in the past. And you've seen consolidation of functions as well, because that's more efficient. But with that consolidation, often you lose checks and balances. You're seeing decreasing levels of transparency and accountability. I mean, you just got to look at things like FOI, speeches. There's a whole range of measures there you can look at and say that, yeah, it's the transparency, particularly in Australia. This is one of the reasons I tend to rely personally on a lot of things in the United States about government and so on, because we don't have the same levels of transparency. And accountability, so you will sort of see that, well, really, it's not necessarily ministers are accountable or federal government's accountable, it might be a state, which may well be the case. But then we need to make sure that people step up and say, yes, this didn't work and why, and actually acknowledge that things don't always work, because we know that they don't. Technology is a mediating layer between government and the citizen. And this is an important one too when we think about technology in a surveillance state. What's been happening is that people, because they're inefficient and cost money, tend to be taken out and replaced by technology. And so people in the community, citizens, lose that human face of government. And the thing about technology is it attenuates that relationship. It makes it very thin. It doesn't broaden it by saying, actually, there's someone like me. I understand that person. If they say it's right, then yeah, okay, that's probably okay. I can use them as a checker for things like everything from, what this policy actually means to, really, 5G conspiracy. Does that make sense, etc. Instead, we've gone for that digital sort of swipe left, swipe right. This is what you get, etc. So you've got a distancing between government and citizen as a result. Erosion of institutions. Again, we've seen that in large part comes from outsourcing, whereby capability is being lost, and things tend to be underfunded. They tend to be more sclerotic. They're not adaptive. And that's also because we're seeing shifts in the operating environment. Speed is a big thing. Just the pace of change is making it hard for people to keep up. And then on top of that, we've got changes in the geopolitical and threat environment, which government is trying to respond to. So out of all that, what we find is that most of the effort has gone towards that value of anticipation. So a lot of money keeps going into those security agencies because they're saying, actually, we can anticipate this or let you know if something's happening. And decision makers are tending to say, well, if that's the case, then I don't have to worry about the other parts, because if something's happening, I'll have some lead time and some opportunity to do things. And that's a fair judgment. The problem is this only works if you do all three. The protection of the individual and so on comes where, the infantilization, as I've heard it called, about people and, taking that agency away from them. Don't worry about that. I'll look after it for you. Tends to be the predominant narrative here. And you can see that with the quarantine, with states of emergency and so on in the pandemic. But what's been left, what's been underfunded, what's been undernourished, more importantly, is that notion of national resilience. That's missing in this equation. And if we look at what the effects of the technology that's happening at the moment, well, contact tracing is very much around protection. Some of it is around anticipation as well, particularly once we start getting those social networks and social network graphs in place. Social distancing and movement control is around protection. But once you start collecting data about what those particular spaces are, then you can anticipate that if people go into these spaces, there may be an issue or associated with that particular activity. Epidemiological pattern modelling probably falls a bit more in that anticipation, but also because it's a longer standing thing and you're building capability, probably does fall a bit more over into the national resilience side as well. Quarantine and travel permissions, again, protection. Symptom tracking is probably the one that I would say is actually helping build national resilience because it's helping build a community and it's helping build people's sense of agency. And then if we look at the other elements that have been looking at in terms of technology, vulnerabilities, the things like cyber vulnerabilities are bringing all of it or undermining all of these elements as well. Employee monitoring, the same, because it's undermining trust in society, undermining trust in employees, undermining trust in between employer and manager and staff. But also that data is actually could be quite valuable. You're seeing a lot about practices and a lot about people's homes, a lot about what's on their monitors and so on in the work. So it actually falls in that sense to the cyber vulnerability. Conspiracies are going to be there regardless. It's how you manage them, that's the issue. And that's why I've actually put social media there and not in red. I actually think social media is actually a good thing overall. It helps inclusion, helps engagement, gives you a diversity of views, which is not a bad thing if you've got the wherewithal to manage it. And lets people almost count, offers the opportunity to counter some of these things too. And the distributed working, I actually would put that in something that helps build resilience. So there's some good things and some bad things and a lot to watch. But overall, I think we need to shift away from that protection, just that protection narrative and this surveillance narrative around anticipation that's going to be, is still the dominant paradigm that we're seeing out of the pandemic. And this leads me on to a couple more observations, and that's around, I don't know if anyone has seen the film Serenity, but this is what I often refer to when I talk about Miranda, this idea that there's absolutes, that you can solve every problem, in this case with the virus, and that's got a really bad downside. The tending towards absolute that you see in narratives around risk-based societies. We will not rest until there are no driver deaths. We will not rest until we absolutely eliminate this, this virus from our society. We will not rest. I will not accept any terrorist deaths, etc. That tends to distort things because the art of politics, the art of public policy is one of compromise. Actually doesn't make sense given the way it can distort the system. That is not being discussed. I worry whenever citizens in a democracy are considered a major risk to society. And that's the case now for terrorism, for hackers, and now for patients and people who are asymptomatic. You're being treated, that understanding of the risk society and governments who are saying that you are a risk is I think, not conducive to a strong democracy. We're in a world of the constant now because these feedback information now, constantly now. What's the update now? We've been watching things like, figures on the virus spread, etc. For a long time. It lends to a continual distraction. It distracts from the future, and it lends itself to what Tim Sadu refers to a politics of eternity in this case, because we're not being given the opportunity for a future, whereas we've moved from a politics of inevitability. Well, it's okay, we don't have to try because it'll be all right, everything's going up. It looks as though it's verging more to the latter, and that's not a good thing for democracy either, because you lose agency, you don't have a future. Dash, I'm not sure this is actually Dash, but in The Incredibles, I think it's Dash who says that when everything importance, nothing is. And this is a fundamental problem. Probably the biggest problem with that paradigm that Oman puts together, because you're in a risk-based society, and everything's a risk, the all hazards approach, as it was called, and occasionally I still see reference to that, means that everything's important. It doesn't allow for prioritization. And when you're working with finite resources and those sort of constraints, you have to prioritize. If you want strategy, those hard decisions shape the priorities. But when everything's important, nothing is. And I think this is a major failing of that paradigm around national security. The last thing is a reference to that state of trust. There is a belief that government deserves to be trusted, but trust, as we know, has to be earned. It cannot be demanded. And how governments and how companies behave with this data and with this technology is going to determine how that trust is earned. And it's typically the requirement is that the stronger and more powerful partner in that relationship needs to trust the less one versus the other, as opposed to the other way around. So in terms of just very briefly, because I'm just noticing the time, I have a belief that what we're seeing is, again, this buildup of what's in complex systems is called criticality. You see pressure building and building, just as you see with earthquakes or avalanches or forest fires or even rain or in the financial markets, etc. There is pressure for change in the system. And I worry when we keep saying we want to go back to normal. There is no normal. There is no going back. So rather than sort of, letting it, just trying to hold the system in, we need to find ways to release that pressure of change in the system. And that might be through, there's a range of opportunities there, I believe, in terms of looking at those institutions. What is suffering? Can we change? What are the things we need to do? And another way of looking at too, and that sort of idea around change, is understanding what changes most slowly and what changes most quickly. So if culture changes most slowly, but it gives you the greatest lever, do you start paying attention to that part of the equation? Or do you go where it's easy to get change? And this is an example, we interact, we know there's change. How do we manifest that in those deeper, slower layers of the overall system? That's going to be a big challenge for how we deal with this going ahead. And last, what we're seeing here is echoes of the 1930s, when fascism was actually fashionable. It was okay to be a fascist in respectable society. And same with authoritarianism. We're seeing the same sort of debates about that versus liberal democracy. As we've seen from early the way treatment of the pandemic, neither is better or worse in handling this. But I think there's a lot to say about the sort of future we want to have. While conditions have favoured that medico-technical liberalism, we're not seeing that balance that you would expect of liberal democracy. Where are the checks and balances? Where are the accountability? Where is the transparency? I've yet to hear someone talk about the efficacy, and seriously, the efficacy of COVID safe, for example. What about the efficacy of some of the border closures? How do we actually know that's working? Now, I know that it's hard to run these things when you can't run a counter argument. But it would be really good to actually, for people to say, no, we have a sunset clause here. And that's why I think what's happening in Victoria is actually quite dangerous because, and again, this is not a left or right issue. This is how you see government and the relationship between government and the community and its responsibilities. In Victoria, they have just announced, I think the Premier's announced that he wants to extend the state of emergency for another 12 months and change legislation accordingly. Where is the checks and balances on this? It's like holding parliaments. We need to actually make sure these things are in place. They're not optional extras. And the further question is, without doing some of these things and thinking these through, we're not going to be able to balance the power of those tech platforms. And that's clearly another issue because the tech platforms are going to end up with more power, more data than even our own governments. And we don't get to vote for those. They will go where the money is. And again, I don't resent them for that. We have a responsibility to be aware of those incentives. We need to place people at the absolute center of this. It's people who are getting sick and dying. And without doing that and without building the narrative and showing how that can be done, we're going to be more prone to social unrest, conspiracy theories and the like. And that in turn will generate a response from government, which I don't think is going to be positive either. So we need to clarify our values, give people agency. There is evidence of resilience and resilience responses to these sort of crises at the community level, which have largely gone ignored. And I'm thinking again of things like, again, how Australia responded to the bushfire crisis, those local community organisations. We need to find ways to actually give them more agency as well and protect them in this space, because they are often the connection between the online world and the physical world as well. They build community, in the best sense. And a lot of this will come from local action. And last, we need to actually reinterpret government as that steward and partner, as opposed to protector and controller. Without that too, I think we're going to be in trouble. We need to find all these things to actually give ourselves a future, because without that future, it's all we can do is just look more and more through the lens of surveillance at the present, and that is not going to resolve the pandemic, nor is it going to help us build a better society afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Siebeck, for such a well-informed and eye-opening talk. Before I come back to your talk, I just would like to point out for our panelists and attendees that they can ask their questions now, both by typing a question in the Q&A section at the bottom of their screen, or by clicking on the raise your hand feature to signal that you have a question to ask. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions now. I like that approach that you have, which I think comes from the fact that you are a policy officer, as you said at the very beginning. That means that you look at issues from the perspective of there is a problem, these are the solutions that people come up with. And I think there are a certain number of very interesting things that you did by mapping what you called the medico-techno security, which I think is really central to your talk. Some of other things also that I picked up that I found really interesting was the fact that, as you mentioned, the pandemic and the response to the pandemic has shown the central importance of the state, something that had been challenged over the past century or so. Is just, the return of the state, and also maybe to a certain extent that shift between public and private, and the fact that maybe these concepts are maybe not relevant anymore because they can become completely blurred, and they're maybe not really relevant to define both our experience and the way in which we should be protected. I have a question, and there is another question also in the Q&A, an early question on the issue of trust that we'll come back to. I was wondering, looking at the type of technology used, the level of coercion imposed, and the issue of trust and distrust, whether you could make a difference or draw distinctions between what we would call Western nations and nation from the Asian or South Asian Pacific region.
Certainly there is, if you look at my model about, the culture, governance, etc., certainly there is differences in the culture. But what we're seeing is it's not that simple. So you take Taiwan. So Taiwan is an Eastern nation, very much a Chinese culture, but it's democratic. And what they've done there, of course, is they've done things like in their constitution, the sanctity of your communications is absolute, which is better than what we've got here in Australia at the moment, for example. So there's a trust in government as a result. They're still struggling their way through it, so it's not by any chance of nirvana. But as a result, I think the citizens are more willing, because there's also a more communitarian spirit as well than, arguably less individualistic, and again, built around those smaller communities than you will find in places like Australia. I think, though, Australia is being remarkably willing, and same with New Zealand, to abide by a lot of those restrictions in place. What I worry about, though, is that people are willing, in a crisis, to engage in what's called rally round the flag behaviours. So that's why the government's doing well in the polls, for example. And you saw exactly the same behaviour in the UK in World War II with Churchill. And you saw it with George W. Bush too, with September 11. There was a lot of rally around the flag behaviour. But that's short-lived. So Churchill was thrown out of the election towards the end of the war. A lot of what we're seeing now in the US is also a pushback against that assumption that you see in governments about how they can take, they can take privileges, they can engage in overreach. And so I think that one of the things that has to be remembered here in terms of talking about trust in society, it's not, what people are doing is they're giving trust to the government, but it's not necessarily being returned. And this is this is a marathon. It's going to be around for a long time. It's not a sprint. I think the government could get away with it for a short period of time, but over time there's going to be more pushback unless there's a future, unless there's vaccines, unless people are allowed to engage in, and take opportunities to do new things as well. I don't want to necessarily go back, but they want comfort and surety. I think just thinking about other countries in our region and how their responses have been. So, China, essentially controlled the virus as best we're aware, because again, transparency and openness is a problem there too, but as best we're aware by, sort of that authoritarian over the, top-down control. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to also retain it for a long time. In Singapore, the things like the contagion has increased in a lot of the foreign workers, but it's largely being controlled by the government. And again, they've imposed controls that reflect that willingness to, they're not they're fairly a liberal state to top-down controls. So the ones I always go back to tend to be more Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, in understanding that difference and sort of trying to work out whether it's a cultural thing or a governance thing. And so far, there's, you can see the same sort of things in they're just like any other Western nations. Some are good, some are bad. I don't think it's a deeper cultural thing in terms of Asian, whether Asian cultures and so on.
Okay. I'd like to engage with Maria O'Sullivan, who is doctor at Monash University, Monash Law. And I'm going to read to you what she says. She typed that in the Q&A questions. You mentioned the need for trust. I agree this is vital. Do you think that that would be enhanced by a tech assessment tool? For instance, the Human Rights Commission has raised the issue of having an AI assessment tool when new technologies are developed, but do you think the issue is more broadly about government and therefore you need something like a national integrity body? And then she actually said that you actually mentioned the move to efficiency and outsourcing and the link to trust, and it was a problem in the COVID app, COVID Safe app.
Okay, let me just take the first one about the AI assessment tool. I always worry when the solution to a technology problem is more technology. And particularly if there's an app for that. An app is part of an ecosystem. It is the interface for a broader ecosystem. And I think to be effective, it needs to be, there might be some sort of technology tool that you can use as a heads up. This is of concern, for example, and you need to do X, but it's not going to necessarily solve it. Around that, and in and of itself, it's not going to solve it. Around that, you'll need to have some, is there recourse? And one of the things that worries me about these other technology solutions, where is the recourse? So is there recourse, what happens if you find a problem? Is there recourse to be able to resolve it? What about the laws and regulations? And I rage against the legalistic, simple sort of, legalistic view in as much as, we'll just pass legislation to fix that problem, as much as I do about the technology side as well. So, for example, you take Christchurch, the Prime Minister passed, law to sort of solve that problem within 16 hours. That was not democratic. There was no debate. There was no consideration. How can you do this? But that, was solve the problem. So that any solutionism of any sort worries me. So I haven't seen what the Human Rights Commission is talking about, but I would be happier if it was, a tool plus recourse plus education plus, is there, what else is there around this that's going to help? Now, that's not to say that, I'm all in favour of engaging lots of thickets to stop things from happening. I'm much more of a dynamist, but as I said, I worry when we just have, a single quick solution to these problems. I think the issue around outsourcing and the efficiency paradigm, worries me a lot. Having done 4 budgets inside budget group, and you know when you're inside this environment, you know and others know that this is a problem. You know and others know when there's a problem with the offsets rule. So every time someone wants to have a new policy, they have to find the money from somewhere. And so what all this does is weaken and undermine a lot of the programs that are in government in place. And things such as, when you're trying to sort of say, okay, my program is this size, but I need to cut it down to that size because that's how much money I got. The things that always go missing, get cut are security, privacy, documentation, often engagement with the community because you don't have time to do this. There'll be things around, often there'll be, we don't need those middle managers. We need sort of people who do technology. And so you end up missing a lot of people who say, actually, hold on, this doesn't make sense. Have you thought about legal provisions? Have you thought about where this might go in the future as a result? There was a study done some years ago of, I think it was the video games community, about what made really good video games in terms of, at least with the private sector, there's good measures like profitability that you can draw on. And they found that the most profitable video game companies were those people who are derided as middle managers, the project managers who made things work together, who were able to synthesize things. It wasn't the creative types, it wasn't the best programmers, it was those people in the middle. And I think and this is what, again, when I talk about the loss of expertise in the public service, it's not just that the public service itself doesn't have people who are competent and on top of the technology, digital technology or cyber, etc., or even sort of that combination of things. It's people who know how to get this sort of stuff done in that environment. So that's one issue. What it does do is it undermines trust because promises are made and not delivered, or they're delivered on inadequately, and there's no feedback. There's usually no recourse for these things as well. So what's often, again, this is something that David Omand mentioned in his books. He talks about the fact that the intelligence agencies, and they're very broad now. It's not like the old Cold War intelligence agencies. These are, the agencies that engage in surveillance are your tax agency, human services, people tracking financial records, etc. It's a huge apparatus. But Omand makes a point that they need to be open and transparent and talk about what they do. The problem is, unless you are willing to acknowledge where you failed, where you fell short, what you didn't expect, everything else is marketing. And people see through marketing. So that also erodes trust as well. And then, of course, there's unwillingness of people to stand up and say, hey, I did that wrong, or we made a decision to call that out.
I have another question for you from Osmar Bernotate. Do you see any government-led initiatives that encourage the creation of these new systems based on trust, such as grants, invites to submit ideas, as you can see in Taiwan?
Trust. So part of the problem when in government is how do you actually define and articulate things like resilience and trust and so on? So how could you base a grant system around trust? We can get researchers to research trust, but how do you implement a system that's based on trust when particularly, government is highly contingent because government wants to be able to do things that suited at the time. And trust is a long-term thing. It takes time. It doesn't actually fit in an election cycle. So I think there's, for most governments, that is a real challenge. I actually, I'd like to see them experiment with this. I would like to see, trust being built by things like digital, again, you take COVID safe. It took a long time for the code, for that to be opened. It is still not on GitHub. It is still, we still don't know what the code is on the servers where the data is being stored, for example. So that's the sort of thing you want for those sort of things because, diversity of views and diversity of expertise gives you strong software and better laws. So yeah, it's if they take trust seriously, I do like the idea. If they were to take trust seriously, yes, it would be a great idea for the government to say, right, we're going to put out and start actually engaging with the community. And this is where I wrote a piece for ASPI a while ago about the differences between the US technology systems and European technology systems. And it came out from when I was doing my PhD, when I noticed the difference between the European and US, every second year be Europe, alternate years would be in the US, around, was it the Computer Supported Collaborative Work Conferences. In the US, it's very much focused on technology. In Europe, it's very much focused on the social aspects. But the other thing I noticed about Europe, and why I really like that idea too, is that there's an active engagement of the community all the way along. Whereas in the US, it tends very much to be the dynamism will come from the private sector. And that's fine. That's a different, I'm not making judgments about what's better or worse. But when you are talking about things like trust, and this is where I think, platforms are often trusted more than governments, you have to have that community engagement in one way or another.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I wondered if I could just come in. Is that all right, Anne? Just to really more of an observation, but Lesley may want to respond. I mean, I thought it was great. I really found it interesting, and I thought it was really terrific to tie both COVID and then surveillance into a big picture about the kind of society we live in, and your points about trust and efficiency and so on, which other people have already commented on, are really great. And I think also the way in which you was thinking about security. I mean, and there's an implied idea in your modelling that what we're interested in is the security of the citizen as protected by the state. Of course, there's another model, which is that what we really want is the security of the state, which needs to be protected from the citizen. Yeah. Those are really two opposite models, and maybe they're, like that idea that really what matters is the security of the state rather than the security that the state provides is not always expressed as explicitly as that, but I think it's clearly there. And if you think about things like freedom of information laws and whistleblowing laws, they all go directly to the question of trust and agency of citizens, as opposed to the idea that trust and agency somehow threatens the state.
Yeah.
I mean, like, this is the big question, the big tension. And so, I'm thinking just today we had in the news a chap who lost their job in the public service for posting on a private blog an extremely anodyne remark. In fact, very much what you said in the course of your talk earlier on, that one of the areas that benefits a lot from what's been happening with COVID is big tech and big tech itself. And for that, after the Banerjee decision last year, it was decided that was somehow, incommensurable with his responsibility as a public service, and it wasn't even critical of governments. It was vaguely critical of technology companies, and that was enough to stifle that remark and to lead the person to resign from the public service. The Banerjee decision seems to me an enormously important decision for what happens in this space about how you build questions of trust and resilience and protect the security of people from the state as well as just protecting the state.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is actually quite worrying, but I'll make a couple of observations about Australian political culture. So a lot of the stuff I read, again, because it's available, tends to be from the US, somewhat from Europe. But the US democracy is very different to ours. We all think we're the same, particularly being in Five Eyes when you're in that environment. But I try as I must, I can't find an expression of Australian political philosophy. I hope someone might be able to sort of point me in a direction. The closest I can get is, I think there's a Judith Brett point about how a lot of our political thinking is essentially descended from late 1800s Britain. So while the US, often we'll talk about John Stuart Mill and John Locke and so on, it's actually Thomas Paine that, really drives that thing. And Thomas Paine had this idea, again, he's influenced too, of course, by the French, but Thomas Paine had this idea about the individual, then the state. In Australia, we are descended, if you like, politically from Jeremy Bentham, utilitarian. Jeremy Bentham says it's the state, then the person. And that drives a lot of thinking. And, you find these sort of trends that sort of just these threads from a very long time ago. I mean, I've noticed that, in other, organisationally, where there'll be something as a position 50 years ago, and that's why that position always is. But in political philosophy in Australia, I think that's the difference you make. And it's worrying, therefore, again, that's, the attitude is that the government is there to protect people because it's that almost that patriarchal sort of, a view of the world. Government is also very good at building systems for itself, even though they'll talk about user-centered design. It is certainly not the same way that you will find, say, in Estonia or Taiwan, for that matter. And so all these systems are built for the purpose of government to facilitate its existence, really, as in charge of this nation state. Our constitution doesn't mention people. It's and again, I'm aware I've got constitutional lawyers on the line here, but it was a result of a negotiation between states. It's nothing like the American Constitution, but we all say we're democracies, and even the UK has moved on politically. We haven't. And that's I find it really worrying when public servants, for anodyne comments, tell you you can't say anything because, hey, the military can.
Yeah.
And they're armed public servants.
Yeah.
And I think they should be able to too. And even so, I think the civilians should be able to speak as well.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, I don't want to hold on to the conversation. I will just mention you were talking about where to find references to Australian political philosophy. There's a book came out a long time ago by Louis Hartz, and it was called Fragment Cultures.
Okay.
And his argument was basically that colonial societies in particular tend to be frozen at the moment where they cut the apron strings.
Yeah.
So America is 18th century England. And a lot of its political structure makes a lot of sense when you look at before the formation of political parties and all that sort of thing. Whereas Australia is late 19th century England with that particular kind of structure about class and things like that. And you can even go to a place like Quebec, which is actually pre-revolutionary French because it was separated from France before the French Revolution. And so a lot of it makes sense. It's ancien regime in the colonies.
Okay, no, I'll look that up. Thank you very much. Okay. Just noticing other comments there.
We've got another comment on old normal of stigmatization and protection of the weak.
Yeah. So smallpox too, I think, has an asymptomatic period. There's about 10 days before that becomes symptomatic. So COVID in that sense, I mean, I keep saying to people, we've been here before, but on a smaller scale, and the difference is essentially the technology and the the globalization and connectedness. But smallpox also has got a fair time before it can be symptomatic. And in that period, you can infect people. So yeah, trusting people is not enough to defeat it. By and large, yes. And I think part of the problem here is that we just don't know the effects as yet. And then certainly until a lot of this is on hold until we can get a vaccine. The duty in the Siebeck might be, so this is where I find Sweden an interesting case study. Yes, their numbers went up. Yes, it was not popular, particularly with their neighbours. And they still had a fair, because the elderly are more prone to get some of the worst symptoms and die from this. But there was that act of trying to sort of make sure that the elderly were protected. I think the other problem we have too is we're all still on a bit of a learning curve here as well. So I can understand why governments have cracked down as much as they can. What worries me is when they, and again, this is a case with Victoria, seem to be instituting, they're normalising these behaviours. So I think in answer to that question about, how we can protect the weak, etc., we just have to bear in mind that we cannot stay in this state forever. This is going to be a marathon. We're going to have to find some ways to do that. And it may well be that, some of the practices we have in our culture have stemmed from these sort of things in the past as well, plagues and other things. Okay.
Professor Siebeck, we are reaching the end of the allocated time for this first conference.
Mm-hmm.
Still, everybody has a lot of unanswered question, unfortunately, but that's the format of the exercise. On behalf of the organisers and the attendees, many thanks for this fascinating talk. Thank you for pointing out the complexity of the medical techno-security world in which we are operating, looking at the way in which technology implements these coercive measures and the way in which this can infringe on our freedoms of movement, association, speech, and press. And the only thing that we can do is hope for the best for the world post-COVID.
Thank you very much, Anne. I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.